7 years. A man named Emmanuel was buried alive behind bars. Not because he committed a crime, but because he was too poor to afford a lawyer. No trial, no voice, no one to listen. Forgotten by the world, abandoned by the system, he watched time rot the walls around him and inside him. Then one day, without warning, the president of the nation, Ibrahim Traore, walked into that very prison. No cameras, no media, just a man looking for the truth. What happened next would force an entire justice system to its knees. But this isn't just a story about law and power. It's about a broken man, a bold leader, and a question we all must ask ourselves. If you were the last person who knew the truth, what would you do? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It was an ordinary morning in Ouagadougou, or so everyone thought. The sun rose slowly over the city, casting soft amber light across rusted tin rooftops and dusty alleyways where life had just begun to stir. Street vendors rolled out their carts. Children in faded uniforms chased one another barefoot on the cracked pavement. The call to prayer echoed faintly from a distant mosque. In the distance, the national flag fluttered on the dome of the presidential palace, unmoving in the heavy morning air. Inside the palace, silence reigned. No aides rushing down the marble corridors. No morning briefings, no press waiting at the gates. Just one man, President Ibrahim Traore, standing alone by a tall window, his figure reflected against the glass like a shadow watching its own nation. He wasn't wearing his uniform today. No ceremonial sash, no lapel pin. Just a plain brown shirt, sleeves rolled up, trousers slightly wrinkled. A small scuff on his shoes suggested he had refused the help of his usual valet. His face was unreadable, not angry, not tired, just still. He turned slowly and said only one sentence to the sole person in the room, his driver. "Start the car. We're going somewhere unannounced." The driver blinked. "Where to, sir?" "The central prison," Traore replied. That was it. No further explanation. No bodyguards, no convoy. Just a single black vehicle rolling quietly out of the presidential gates, trailed only by 2 unmarked police cars for minimal protection. The guards at the entrance gave puzzled salutes, whispering to one another once the car passed. Where is he going? Why alone? Why now? The truth was, no one knew. Not the media, not his ministers, not even his closest advisors. Only Ibrahim Traore, and a question that had kept him awake for nights. Do I really know how my people live, or just how reports say they do? The streets blurred past as the car sped through the heart of Ouagadougou. Colorful murals of political slogans faded into peeling walls. Market noise gave way to silence as they entered the outskirts, where the buildings grew sparse, the air heavier, and a gray concrete compound loomed in the distance. Ouagadougou Central Correctional Facility. The president stared at it, expressionless. From the outside, it looked like a forgotten relic. Tall gray walls topped with barbed wire, dust clinging to every inch, the gates rusted with time and neglect. A place people rarely spoke of, a place meant to be hidden. But what was hidden inside? What stories? What secrets? What faces? What pain? As the vehicle stopped, 2 guards approached, brows furrowed. One squinted into the tinted glass, then froze. His mouth opened, but no words came out. He recognized the man stepping out, not as a politician, but as the president of the republic, now standing in front of him like a regular visitor. "Mr. President, we weren't informed." "I know," Traore replied calmly. "That's why I'm here." There was something unsettling in his tone. Not harsh, not angry, but deliberately quiet, the kind of quiet that made people nervous. Behind the president, the driver remained in the car, tense but silent. The gate creaked open. Inside, the air shifted. The guards exchanged glances. The warden, a short, sweating man named Pascal, came stumbling forward, tie askew, eyes wide. "Sir, if only we had known." "You would have made it look better than it is," Traore interrupted, walking past him. "But I want to see it as it really is." He walked down the first corridor with measured steps. Fluorescent lights flickered above, casting shadows that danced on the walls. From behind rusted bars, a few voices began to murmur. A name echoed in disbelief. Is that the president? No way. Why would he come here? The hallway grew quieter with each step. Something was off. Something bigger than politics. Bigger than optics. This wasn't a photo op. This wasn't rehearsed. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to listen. And somewhere, just a few meters ahead, behind steel doors and silence, was a man whose name he hadn't heard yet, but whose story would soon force a nation to question everything it thought it knew about justice. His name was Emmanuel. The gate groaned open like something ancient waking from sleep. As it did, the weight of the air changed. The dust that clung to the rusted hinges seemed to drift with reluctance, as though even the prison itself was surprised to see who had come knocking. Ouagadougou Central Correctional Facility was not meant for visits like this, especially not from the highest seat of power. President Ibrahim Traore stepped past the threshold without hesitation. Behind him, two stunned guards stood frozen in place, unsure if they should salute or speak. One of them adjusted his cap with shaking fingers, finally stammering, "Mr. President, this is highly unusual. We weren't notified. There was no clearance." "Exactly," Traore said, eyes steady. "That's the point. I'm not here to be received. I'm here to see." The words landed heavier than the dust beneath their boots. Before them stood a vast open yard, ringed by blank, crumbling concrete walls. The barbed wire at the top sagged in places, rust-colored and brittle from too many years under sun and rain. Guard towers stood like silent sentinels, their windows fogged by time and neglect. In the far corners, two crows pecked at something unidentifiable in the dirt. The prison looked less like a correctional facility and more like a monument to things forgotten, or meant to be forgotten. A door on the far side creaked open, and a short man in an ill-fitting blue uniform came hurrying across the yard, sweat already breaking across his brow. This was Warden Pascal, and he knew, just by the look on the president's face, that this was not a visit to be smoothed over. He stopped a few feet away, out of breath, and tried to compose himself. "Sir, had we known, we would have prepared a proper welcome. The files, the reports." "Warden," Traore cut in calmly but firmly, "I don't want files. I don't want numbers. I want to see the people. Take me to them, now." Pascal hesitated, not out of disobedience but out of fear. Not of Traore, but of what he might find. No amount of polished reports could hide the peeling walls, the overcrowded cells, the stench of unwashed bodies and broken hope. No statistics could explain away the missing case files or the screams at night. Still, the order had been given, and there was no refusing it. "This way, Mr. President," he said quietly. They moved across the yard, the dust crunching under their feet. As they walked, eyes began to appear, behind barred windows through cracks in the wall. Inmates, guards, staff. Word traveled fast inside places like this. The president was here, in the prison, no announcement, no press. Why? The hallway they entered was narrow and dim, the overhead lights flickering erratically like a dying pulse. The walls were painted a sickly pale green that peeled at the edges, revealing gray cement underneath. The smell hit instantly, a thick, pungent mix of sweat, metal, and something rotting in the corners. It wasn't just filth, it was hopelessness, soaked into every surface. Traore walked slowly, absorbing every detail. The way the ceiling sagged, the sound of distant coughing, a soft chant coming from one cell, the whisper of bare feet dragging across cold floors. No one spoke to him directly, but their silence screamed louder than words ever could. They passed by an old bulletin board, the notices faded and yellowing. A job posting from 3 years ago, a missing prisoner update, a half-torn sign about inmate rights no one had read in years. "How many prisoners are here currently?" Traore asked. "Officially? 982, Pascal replied, avoiding his gaze. "Unofficially?" The warden hesitated again. "Over 1,200. Some unregistered transfers, overflow from other regions. We've had paperwork issues." Traore nodded slowly, as though confirming something he already suspected. They turned a corner and entered the main cell block. The room expanded suddenly, a long corridor with stacked cells on either side. Metal bars painted black, but chipped and rusted at every joint. Inside the cells, human beings moved like shadows, sitting, lying down, leaning against the walls. Some looked up as the president passed, others didn't bother. And yet, as he moved forward, something began to shift. One by one, the inmates noticed him. Not the uniform, not the guards. Him. The man they'd only seen on blurry TV sets or heard about in speeches. Here now, walking past their cages like he was looking for something. Or someone. A murmur rippled through the corridor. It's him! That's really the president. Why is he here? Traore didn't answer any of them. He didn't need to. His eyes moved from cell to cell, locking briefly with the eyes behind the bars. He saw fear, confusion, bitterness, and sometimes, very faintly, the flicker of something else. Hope. But he hadn't found who he was looking for yet. Not consciously, not exactly. But something deep inside him told him that this visit wasn't random. That someone here, one voice among hundreds, was about to change everything. And so he kept walking. Deeper into the gray, deeper into the silence. Deeper into the story that would soon shake the soul of a nation. President Traore moved slowly, cell by cell, like a man walking through a forgotten museum of suffering. No security detail shadowed him closely now. He had waved them off. What was the point of being protected from the people he had come to understand? He paused at each door, not to observe like an outsider, but to speak, to reach across the metal and meet the eyes behind it. In the first cell, 3 men sat on the floor playing cards with pieces of torn cigarette boxes. One of them stood abruptly when he saw the president, his mouth tightening with uncertainty. Traore simply extended his hand through the bars. "What's your name?" he asked gently. The man hesitated, glanced at the others, then stepped forward. "Yakuba." "How long have you been here, Yakuba?" 5 years. "And what were you accused of?" "Possession, but it wasn't mine." There was no follow-up judgment, no raised eyebrow, just a nod, and then the president's hand on the man's shoulder through the gap. He moved on. At the next cell, 2 young men were asleep, or pretending to be. A third sat awake, legs crossed, eyes hollow. He didn't speak when Traore approached, but he looked up, and for a brief second, the quiet despair in his gaze collided with something steady and warm in the president's own. Some inmates stood when he passed. Some whispered to each other, unsure if this was real. Others stayed silent but stared, their walls slowly cracking under the weight of simple, human attention. Traore asked questions, always the same ones, always gently. "How long have you been here? What were you accused of? Do you have family?" At first the answers came with suspicion, short rehearsed lines, the kind beaten into them by years of no one listening. But slowly, gradually, they began to shift. One man cried mid-sentence. Another whispered the names of children he hadn't seen since their 3rd birthdays. One begged him not to forget what he said after leaving. Traore promised he wouldn't. And then, as the corridor began to dim near the far end, past the main block where cells grew smaller and more shadowed, he stopped. A narrow cell, darker than the rest. Just one man inside, sitting on the floor with his back to the wall. He didn't stand, didn't speak, didn't even lift his head. His hands rested loosely on his knees and his eyes were fixed somewhere beyond the floor, as if they were staring through time itself. The president stepped closer. He didn't say anything right away. He simply stood there, observing the man's stillness. A stillness not born of peace, but of exhaustion. The kind of exhaustion that came from being forgotten. After a long pause, Traore spoke. "What is your name?" There was no answer at first. Then slowly, almost reluctantly, the man raised his head. His face was thin. His eyes were sunken but piercing, tired but too honest to look away. "Emmanuel," he said softly. It was the quietest name Traore had heard all day, and somehow it would be the loudest. For a long moment, there was only silence between them. President Traore stood outside the cell, and Emmanuel sat just inside, still as stone, as if unsure whether this man in plain clothes without guards or press was truly the president, or simply another visitor who would ask, nod, and forget. But something about Traore's presence, the way he didn't rush to speak, didn't force a response, allowed the silence to stretch just long enough to feel safe. Emmanuel shifted slightly. His voice, when it came, was dry, like it had been unused for too long. I was a clerk, worked for the same man for 8 years, arrived early, stayed late, kept his books in order, never stole, never asked for more than what I earned. His eyes stayed low, fixed somewhere between his knees and the dust on the floor. My boss, Laurent Gira, he was a wealthy man. Untouchable, they said. Owned shops across the city. He trusted me. At least, I thought he did. I managed the cash register, balanced accounts. I knew every franc that moved through his hands. He paused, then looked up for a moment. Not at Traore, but past him, like he was seeing a memory play out in the hallway. One day he called me into his office, said money had gone missing, accused me. I was shocked. I begged him to double-check, offered to go through the books with him. He didn't care. He just said, "You've betrayed me. You're fired." That same afternoon, 2 policemen came to my house. No warrant, no explanation. They said my employer had filed a report, and that was enough. The president said nothing, only listened. Emmanuel's voice grew steadier, though there was no anger in it. Just a kind of quiet disbelief, still echoing from 7 years ago. They dragged me into a small room, no windows, left me there for hours. When they came back, they placed a paper in front of me, said it was a confession. I refused. They came back again, this time with threats. Said they'd arrest my wife too. Said they'd make sure my children ended up in the streets. I had nothing to fight them with. No lawyer, no family name, no power. I signed the paper. His voice faltered. I didn't even know what it said. Traore's hands gripped the bars softly. He didn't speak, but his breath had deepened. Emmanuel continued, a bitter laugh breaking his tone for the first time. The trial lasted 8 minutes. 8! The judge barely looked at me. Just read the charge, glanced at the paper, then sentenced me to 15 years. Said I had shown no remorse. He paused again, then turned his head toward the light slipping in through the narrow slit of a window high above. My wife left after the 2nd year, sent papers through her cousin, my children, stopped writing. Maybe she told them I was dead. Maybe it was easier that way. His gaze returned to Traore, and this time he looked him directly in the eyes. You are the first person to ask me what happened in 7 years. Those words didn't sound dramatic. They didn't need to. They were simply true, and that truth was heavier than any shout or accusation. The hallway behind them was quiet. The guard stood still. Even Warden Pascal, who had been trailing nervously behind, was silent now. Something had shifted, the kind of shift that didn't make noise, but which everyone felt in their chest. Traore crouched down, so he was level with Emmanuel. Their faces only a few feet apart now. No steel, no rank, no power between them. Only 2 men, eye to eye. Why didn't you appeal? Emmanuel shook his head slowly. I tried, wrote letters. They came back unopened. One lawyer said he'd help, then asked for money I didn't have. I was invisible, Mr. President, and no one defends the invisible. The president was still for a long time. Then he stood, his expression unreadable. His voice was quiet but carried the weight of something deep and unshakable. You are not invisible now. Emmanuel sat quietly after the president's words. You are not invisible now. The sentence hovered in the air like a distant bell, soft but lingering. And though it brought a flicker of warmth, it could not unwrite the years. He took a deep breath, steadying himself as if he were about to dig into a wound that hadn't fully closed. Do you know what happens when the world forgets you? He said, his voice low, as if afraid the walls themselves might listen. Traore didn't reply. He simply waited. At first you hope, Emmanuel continued. You think maybe there was a mistake. Maybe they'll realize it. Maybe someone will come. You watch the door every day, thinking your wife will walk in, or your brother, or even a stranger with news. And every time the guard passes your cell and doesn't stop, hope dies a little more. His eyes wandered to a rust-colored stain on the wall. It had probably been there before he arrived. But in a place like this, everything starts to feel like it belongs to you. Even the things that rot. The first year, my wife wrote letters. She said she believed me, said she'd fight. Then the letter stopped. No reason, no explanation, just silence. He shifted, fingers absently tracing the lines on the concrete floor. One day her cousin came, said she had moved, said she needed to think of the children. I understood, I did, but I still waited. Every birthday, every holiday, I sat in this cell and waited. There was a pause, not long, but heavy, like a pause before a confession no man wants to say aloud. I haven't heard my children's voices in 6 years. Traore's eyes darkened, not with anger, but something deeper. A kind of mourning for a man who was still alive, but who had been buried all the same. What about friends? He asked quietly. Emmanuel let out a dry laugh. Short, empty, more breath than sound. Friends? He echoed. The ones who shared meals with me, who toasted at my wedding. They disappeared faster than the ink dried on my sentence. I was bad for business. No one wants to stand next to a man accused of stealing, even if they suspect he didn't do it. He paused, then looked around the cell. Not with resentment, but with something worse. Familiarity. This cell became the only thing that remembered I existed. The walls didn't lie. The bars didn't flatter. They just stayed, silent, like the rest of the world. The president took a step closer, the space between them feeling smaller now. The air felt tighter, the light from the window colder. What kept you going? He asked. Emmanuel didn't answer right away. His lips parted, then closed again. He blinked slowly. I'm not sure I did, he said finally. I think I just didn't know how to stop breathing. He turned his head, voice softer than before. I died slowly every day, just not fast enough to leave. That sentence landed with a force words rarely carry, not because it was dramatic, but because it was said so plainly, so honestly. It wasn't anger. It wasn't even sadness. It was the hollow middle ground in between. The place where people go when grief is too tired to scream. There was a long silence. No one moved. Even the air seemed afraid to shift. Then Emmanuel looked up again, this time directly into the president's eyes. Do you believe me? He asked, not pleading, but curious, like a man who had stopped expecting to be believed long ago. Traore's jaw tightened. His voice, when it came, was clear and unwavering. Yes, I do. And somehow, after all the years, all the silence, all the nights Emmanuel had stared into nothing, someone finally said yes. President Traore stood still, hands wrapped loosely around the rusted bars that separated him from Emmanuel. But at that moment, those bars didn't feel like steel. They felt like a thin veil, something invisible, intangible, between two men bound not by power and position, but by something older, deeper, truth. He looked into Emmanuel's eyes, really looked, and saw something that shook him more than the stories he had just heard. Not rage, not bitterness, not even desperation. What he saw was quiet pain, a kind of wound that no one else had ever dared to look at. It wasn't loud or dramatic. It didn't beg to be fixed. It simply existed, raw and heavy, like a scar that had learned how to hide in plain sight. And in that moment, Ibrahim Traore, a man used to holding nations in meetings, giving speeches before crowds, shaking hands with presidents and kings, felt something shift inside him. Not pity, not politics, but recognition. Here was a man who had been buried alive in silence, and still he hadn't screamed. Traore exhaled slowly. Then he said the words that would later echo across the country, but for now were meant only for one man. I believe you. Emmanuel blinked. He didn't flinch, didn't smile. He just stared, stunned by the unfamiliar weight of being believed. Not suspected, not excused. Believed. Mr. President, a voice stammered behind him. It was Warden Pascal, unsure whether he had just witnessed an overstep or a revolution. Traore turned, his voice low but firm. Bring me his case file. His file, sir? Today, before sunset. I want everything. The arrest report, the judge, the accuser. I want names, signatures, Every line of what put him here. If something is missing, find it. If it no longer exists, tell me who made it disappear. Pascal hesitated, then nodded, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Yes, Mr. President, right away. Traore turned back to Emmanuel, who still sat motionless on the floor. Your story is not over, he said. Not if I have anything to do with it. For a moment, neither man moved. There was no grand applause, no music, just the soft hum of flickering prison lights and the distant sound of a metal gate closing somewhere deep in the facility. But something had already opened. Not just a case file, not just a prison door, a fault line. And through it, something long buried began to rise. Not loud, not yet. But it was there, just beneath the skin of a broken system. Hope. As Traore walked back down the corridor, the eyes that once watched him in confusion now followed him with something different. Something cautious, something fragile, but something real. A man had come, a man had listened, and now the system would have to answer. The moment President Ibrahim Traore stepped out of Ouagadougou Central Prison, the weight of the morning pressed down harder than before. The sun hung high, casting sharp shadows across the dusty streets as the presidential vehicle pulled away silently from the imposing gray walls. No cameras flashed. No reporters scrambled for a statement. This was not a moment for show. It was a mission. Inside the sleek black car, Traore sat still, his eyes fixed on the horizon, but his mind racing faster than the engine beneath him. His driver glanced sideways, breaking the silence hesitantly. Sir, you want me to cancel your schedule for the day? Traore nodded without turning. Cancel everything. I'm heading straight to the Ministry of Justice. The vehicle slid through the city's tangled streets, weaving past bustling markets and quiet neighborhoods alike, carrying a man whose thoughts were far beyond the roads beneath them. At the ministry, chaos was already waiting. The corridors buzzed with whispered rumors and hurried footsteps. Advisors and ministers glanced at each other, uncertain why the president had arrived unannounced and so abruptly. They expected him at the presidential palace later that afternoon for a scheduled meeting. Instead, here he was, storming through the entrance with an urgency that silenced the room. Traore made his way to the Minister of Justice's office without pause. The door was barely closed behind him before the minister looked up, eyes wide with surprise and concern. Mr. President, this is unexpected. To what do we owe this visit? Traore's gaze was steady, his voice calm but resolute. I visited the central prison this morning. The room fell silent. There, I met a man named Emmanuel. The minister shifted uncomfortably. Emmanuel, he has been imprisoned for 7 years on charges he insists he did not commit. Traore's eyes burned with intensity. The courts failed him. The system failed him. The minister swallowed. Sir, reopening a case is not a favor, Traore interrupted. It is a duty, and not just for Emmanuel, for every man, woman, and child who suffers in silence behind these walls. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle in the room like a heavy fog. I want his full case file by the end of the day. Every document, every witness statement, every note from the judge who presided over his trial. I want to know who arrested him, who judged him, and why he had no legal support. The minister nodded, already reaching for a phone. Yes, Mr. President, I'll have the team start immediately. Traore continued. Set up an independent task force. No politicians, no influence. Just honest lawyers, investigators, and human rights experts. Their mission, to review Emmanuel's case and find others like him. He looked around the room, meeting each face with unflinching determination. Justice delayed is justice denied. We cannot let corruption or complacency rob our citizens of their freedom any longer. Advisors murmured in agreement, inspired by the president's unwavering resolve. This is not just about one man, Traore said firmly. This is about our nation's soul. Within hours, orders were dispatched across government departments. Files were pulled from dusty shelves, digital archives searched and cross-referenced. The wheels of a massive investigation began to turn. Outside, the news had yet to break, but inside the walls of power, a quiet revolution had begun. A mission had been set. One man's story had sparked a fire that would challenge decades of neglect, and at its center stood a president unwilling to turn away from injustice. The investigation began like peeling back layers of a rotten onion, each file, each testimony, revealing a deeper stench of corruption and deceit. The team of independent lawyers, investigators, and human rights experts worked tirelessly, sorting through mountains of paperwork, much of it stained, torn, or missing altogether. From the moment they found Emmanuel's case file, it was clear something was terribly wrong. The arrest report was hastily written, with crucial details omitted. The paperwork lacked the signature of a defense attorney because there had been none. No record showed Emmanuel had ever been given legal counsel or allowed to speak in his own defense. The team discovered that the confession Emmanuel had signed was far from voluntary. Witnesses, when they could be found, claimed they had never seen Emmanuel commit any crime. One investigator uncovered a statement written under duress, forced by threats against Emmanuel's family. But the most damning evidence lay in the trial transcripts. The judge who presided over the case was known for his harsh sentences and even harsher dealings behind closed doors. The team found records linking him to a series of investigations for bribery, allegations he had narrowly escaped thanks to political protection. He had a reputation for quick rulings, often ignoring evidence that might favor defendants, especially the poor and powerless. And then there was Lauren Guerra, the wealthy employer who had accused Emmanuel. The investigation revealed that Guerra's influence extended far beyond his businesses. He had connections in the police force, ensuring swift arrests and minimal scrutiny. Several witnesses testified that Guerra had threatened employees to remain silent, using his wealth as a weapon. The files showed Guerra's name popping up repeatedly in cases where workers were accused of theft or fraud, cases that vanished or were fast-tracked with suspicious speed. One former employee, who spoke under condition of anonymity, described Guerra's tactics. If you don't stay quiet, they'll make sure you lose everything. Your job, your reputation, even your freedom. I was lucky to leave before it was too late. The deeper the investigators dug, the clearer the pattern became, a system rigged to protect the powerful, punish the vulnerable, and silence the truth. Emmanuel's case was not an isolated incident. It was a symptom of a broken justice system, a system where evidence was fabricated, witnesses coerced, and judges bought, where the scales of justice tipped wildly in favor of those who paid the highest price. The news reached President Traore late into the night. He read every page, every note, every complaint, the stories of countless others who had suffered in silence, just like Emmanuel, filled the reports. His face was stern, the lines around his eyes deepening. But beneath the weight of the revelations was a flicker of resolve. This was exactly why he had come, not just to free one man, but to confront the rot eating away at the heart of his nation. The next morning, he gathered his closest advisors. "This is worse than we feared," he said, "but it's not too late. We must act swiftly. No more delays. No more excuses." He announced plans for comprehensive reforms, judicial reviews, transparency measures, protections for defendants' rights, and a crackdown on corruption. But he knew the road ahead would be long and dangerous. Powerful forces would resist. Some would try to silence the movement before it grew too loud. Yet as he looked around the room, he saw determination mirrored in every eye, a shared belief that justice, though battered, could still be reclaimed. And Emmanuel's silent courage was the spark, a spark ready to ignite a revolution. The morning sun hung low but bright over Ouagadougou, casting long shadows across the courtyard of the central prison. Today was unlike any other. For the first time in 7 years, the gates would open not to confine, but to release a man whose very name had become a symbol of silent injustice: Emmanuel. President Ibrahim Traore arrived early, flanked not by the usual silence of secrecy, but by a swarm of cameras, reporters, and flashing lights. The media buzzed with anticipation, capturing every step of a leader who had chosen to stand with the unheard, the forgotten. Inside, Emmanuel sat quietly in a small holding area, the reality of the day beginning to seep into his bones. The walls that had once trapped him now seemed impossibly close, and yet outside waited a world that felt strange, overwhelming, and frightening. When the prison doors creaked open, Emmanuel's steps were hesitant. The harsh metal bars gave way to the warmth of sunlight, and for a moment he stood motionless, blinking against the brightness. Tears welled up, spilling slowly down his weathered cheeks. Tears not of sorrow, but of disbelief, relief, and fragile hope. The years behind these walls had etched lines on his face, dulled the fire in his eyes, and hardened his spirit. Yet now, as the breeze touched his skin, something inside began to thaw. The crowd outside surged with emotion. Families reunited, strangers cheered, and reporters shouted questions that seemed both overwhelming and meaningless at once. "I'm free," Emmanuel whispered, voice barely above the hum of the gathering crowd. President Traore approached, placing a steady hand on Emmanuel's shoulder. Their eyes met, the weight of 7 lost years compressed into a silent understanding between them. "This is just the beginning," Traore said softly. "Not only for you, but for all who still suffer behind these walls." The president then stepped forward to the microphones, his voice carrying clear and strong through the air. "Today we correct a grave mistake. Emmanuel was wrongfully imprisoned, a victim of a corrupt system that failed to protect the innocent. We owe it to him and to every citizen to ensure justice is served fairly and transparently." As his words echoed, Emmanuel looked around at the faces, curious, hopeful, sometimes skeptical. The path ahead was uncertain, but this moment marked a turning point. For Emmanuel, the world outside was no longer a distant dream, but a reality he had to navigate anew. Every step forward was a challenge. Unfamiliar sounds, hurried conversations, the sting of freedom he had longed for but never expected. He did not yet know what the future held, but as the sun climbed higher, washing over the city and the man once forgotten, there was a quiet promise whispered on the wind. Hope was alive, and with it, the possibility of change. The heavy wooden door to the presidential guest house creaked open, revealing a room bathed in soft morning light. For Emmanuel, it was a world apart from the cold, gray walls he had known for 7 long years. The air smelled faintly of fresh linens and polished wood, a quiet promise of comfort that seemed almost unreal. He stood at the threshold, hesitant, as if stepping into a dream he feared might vanish the moment he reached out to touch it. A kind-faced attendant approached gently, offering a warm smile and a clean towel. "Welcome, Emmanuel," she said softly. "You can rest here. Take your time." The words sank in slowly. Emmanuel nodded, his throat tight with emotions too complex for words. He shuffled into the bathroom, the cool tiles unfamiliar beneath his bare feet. Water flowed over him, warm, cleansing, almost miraculous. For the first time in years, he felt the weight of grime and despair wash away, replaced by something lighter, almost fragile, hope. He lingered under the stream, eyes closed, savoring the sensation. Each drop seemed to wash away not only dirt but years of silence, fear, and loneliness. When he stepped out, wrapped in a soft white towel, his reflection in the mirror startled him. The face staring back was thinner, worn by time and hardship. Yet in his eyes there was a flicker, a quiet strength beginning to ignite. Later, Emmanuel was led to a dining room where a simple meal awaited him. The scent of fresh bread, warm soup, and fruit filled the air, scents that belonged to a world he'd almost forgotten. He sat quietly, hands trembling slightly as he picked up the utensils. With each bite, memories of prison meals, cold, scarce, tasteless, faded into the background. This was nourishment not just for his body, but for his spirit. Outside the window, the gardens of the presidential residence bloomed with color, bright flowers and green leaves dancing gently in the breeze. The world beyond prison walls was alive, vibrant, and waiting. As he ate, Emmanuel's thoughts drifted to the past, to the years lost in darkness, to the faces he'd seen behind bars, to the silence that had almost swallowed him whole. But here, in this room filled with light and kindness, he felt a tentative promise that the future might be different. The door opened softly and President Traore stepped inside, his presence calm but commanding. "Emmanuel," he said, his voice steady, "this is your home now. Not just this room, but the country. We will make sure your voice is heard." Emmanuel looked up, a faint smile touching his lips for the first time in what felt like forever. The weight of his past still pressed on him, but for the first time, it did not define him. "You are not a prisoner anymore," Traore continued. "You are a symbol, a reminder that justice must reach every corner of our nation. They spoke quietly, discussing plans for the future, for reforms, for other innocent people still behind bars, for a system that could be fixed. But in that moment, words were less important than the shared understanding between two men, one who had suffered in silence and one determined to break that silence for good. As Emmanuel settled into the soft bed later that evening, the sounds of the outside world filtered through the open window. Children playing, birds singing, the distant hum of a city waking up. For the first time in years, he felt something he hadn't known was possible: belonging. And with belonging came hope. The grand hall was filled with a hush that held both anticipation and uncertainty. The room was packed with government officials, journalists, human rights activists, and members of the public, eyes all fixed on the man who was about to step onto the stage. Emmanuel stood behind the podium, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the microphone. The spotlight felt heavy, casting a warm glow that seemed to amplify every heartbeat in his chest. This was not the cold, gray confinement of his prison cell. This was a different kind of exposure, one that brought with it a responsibility he was still learning to carry. For a moment, he struggled to find his voice. The memories of years spent behind bars, the loneliness, the pain, the silence, crowded his mind. But beneath the weight of his past was a rising determination, a spark ignited by the president's trust in the hope of those still waiting in the shadows. He cleared his throat softly and spoke, his voice low at first but gaining strength with every word. "I am not here for revenge," Emmanuel began, his eyes scanning the crowd, meeting the gaze of those who had listened, waited, and believed in change. "I am here for those still unheard, for the thousands whose stories remain locked behind walls, forgotten by a system that should protect them." A ripple of emotion spread through the audience. Some nodded solemnly, others blinked back tears. Emmanuel's words carried the weight of truth, raw and unfiltered. He continued, sharing glimpses of his own story, not to seek sympathy, but to illuminate the brokenness of the system that had failed him. "I was a man who trusted in justice," he said, "only to find it turned its back on me. But I am not alone. Too many suffer in silence, trapped by corruption and neglect. Today we take the first step toward changing that." The crowd erupted in applause, but Emmanuel remained focused, grounded by the responsibility before him. This was no longer just about his own freedom, it was about a mission. Shortly after his speech, President Ibrahim Traore formally announced Emmanuel's appointment as the leader of the newly formed Justice Review Task Force. The group's purpose was clear: to investigate wrongful imprisonments, expose corruption, and restore faith in the nation's legal system. In the days that followed, Emmanuel threw himself into his new role with quiet resolve. He met with lawyers, human rights experts, and former prisoners. He traveled to remote prisons and urban detention centers, listening carefully to every story, every plea for justice. Though the weight of his past lingered, Emmanuel's perspective had shifted. No longer merely a victim, he was becoming a voice for those who had been silenced. His experiences gave him credibility, but it was his compassion and commitment that inspired others to join the cause. He understood the challenges ahead: resistance from powerful interests, the slow grind of bureaucratic change, and the emotional toll of revisiting trauma. Yet with each new case reviewed, each prisoner released, he felt the steady pulse of progress. Emmanuel's journey from despair to leadership was not just a personal transformation, it symbolized a nation's struggle for justice and dignity. At a press conference weeks later, Emmanuel was asked about his newfound role and the road ahead. He paused, then replied, "I do this not because I am special, but because I am one of many. My story could have been forgotten, but someone listened. Now I listen to others. Together we will be the change this country needs." His words echoed beyond the room, reaching those still behind bars, those waiting for a chance to be heard. From victim to leader, Emmanuel had become a beacon of hope, not only for himself but for all who dreamed of justice. The office of the presidential palace quickly became inundated with letters, thousands of them, each one a testament to pain, desperation, and an unwavering hope for justice. Handwritten notes from remote villages, typed pleas from city lawyers, short messages from families who had lost all faith, and even messages from prison guards haunted by what they had witnessed. Emmanuel sat at a long wooden table stacked high with envelopes and faded paper, his fingers tracing the names and addresses, the words written in hurried script or carefully penned lines. Each letter told a story, stories of men and women languishing behind bars for crimes they never committed, stories of families torn apart, of voices silenced by corruption and neglect. Together with his team, a small group of lawyers, investigators, and volunteers, Emmanuel read every letter with painstaking care. Some brought tears, others stirred a fierce determination. The sheer volume was overwhelming, but each letter was a call that could not be ignored. My brother has been locked away for 10 years, though no one can produce evidence. One letter read, "My son was taken away without trial. I have no money for a lawyer. No one listens," another said. "Please help us. We are forgotten," came a note from a mother in a dusty village far from the capital. These were not just words on paper. They were cries for help echoing across the country. Emmanuel knew that reading these letters was only the beginning. They needed to act, to visit these forgotten places, to listen directly to those trapped in silence, to uncover truths hidden by bureaucracy and fear. The Justice Review Task Force began organizing visits to prisons across the nation, prioritizing those with the highest numbers of long-term inmates and cases lacking legal representation. Emmanuel led the first delegation, traveling to towns few in the capital had ever seen. In every prison they entered, they found overcrowded cells, broken promises, and stories that mirrored Emmanuel's own. Men and women who had waited years for a chance to be heard, for a glimmer of hope. Some greeted Emmanuel with suspicion, others with tears. Many had lost all faith that anyone cared. But Emmanuel spoke with a quiet conviction that began to break down walls thicker than stone. He listened without judgment, asked questions with patience, and promised to carry their stories forward. In one small town, a prisoner named Isidore told them how he had been jailed for over a decade on charges that never held up to scrutiny. He had no lawyer, no trial, only a hastily scribbled document that sealed his fate. "Why do you still believe someone will come?" Emmanuel asked softly. "Because you are here," Isidore replied, voice shaking. "You believe me." That moment, more than any speech or report, became the fuel that kept the task force moving. Word of their work spread quickly. Families wrote more letters, offering names, dates, and testimonies. Lawyers volunteered to join the cause. Even some prison guards touched by Emmanuel's mission began quietly assisting with information. The momentum was building. The invisible were becoming visible. The silenced were finding a voice. And at the center of it all stood Emmanuel, a man who had once been forgotten himself, now determined to bring light to the darkest corners of the justice system. The morning light filtered through the tall windows of the Justice Review Task Force office, illuminating rows of files and stacks of documents. Emmanuel sat behind a worn desk, his eyes scanning a newly arrived complaint that had landed on his table just moments before. It was a routine part of their work. Dozens of cases to review, names to cross-check, patterns to uncover. But then his gaze froze. There it was, a name he knew all too well. Laurent Guerra, the man who had destroyed his life 7 years ago. Laurent Guerra, wealthy businessman, influential figure, and the man who had wielded power like a weapon, manipulating the system to serve his own interests. The same man who had accused Emmanuel of theft, sparking the chain of events that led to his wrongful imprisonment. Now again, Guerra's name appeared on a complaint. This time, it wasn't about Emmanuel. It was 5 other workers, former employees accused of theft, fraud, and disloyalty. The pattern was unmistakable. Emmanuel's heart tightened. He had hoped that with the truth revealed and his innocence proven, Guerra's influence would be diminished. That justice would finally reach those who had suffered under his shadow. But this was proof that the corruption was still alive, and the cycle was far from over. He called over his assistant, a young woman named Awa, and pointed to the file. "Look at this. It's the same story. Same accusations, same tactics. We can't let this continue." Awa nodded, her expression serious. "He's still using his power to silence people. We have to act fast." Emmanuel leaned back in his chair, the weight of years pressing down on him. Memories flooded back. The betrayal, the arrest, the lonely nights behind bars. But now those memories fueled a different fire. Determination. He picked up the phone and called President Traore's office immediately. "Mr. President," Emmanuel said, voice steady but urgent, "I've found something. Laurent Gira. He's still framing innocent workers. We need to investigate." The president's reply was swift. "Prepare a special commission. Independent lawyers, police officers, journalists. No interference, no delays. It's time to expose the truth." Within days, the task force assembled a team dedicated to investigating Gira's company and its practices. They dug through financial records, interviewed former employees, and uncovered testimonies of intimidation and coercion. One former security guard, Pascal, recounted how he had been forced to sign a confession under threat to his family. Another worker, Awa, spoke of being imprisoned simply for speaking out against illegal labor conditions. The evidence painted a grim picture of a man who built his empire on the suffering of others, using bribes, threats, and false accusations to maintain control. Emmanuel followed every report closely. The pain of his past mingled with the hope of justice being served at last. He prepared for the public announcement of the investigation, knowing that this moment would be pivotal, not just for him, but for all those who had suffered in silence. As he stood before the press weeks later, Emmanuel's voice was calm but resolute. "Laurent Gira is not just a man. He is a symbol of a corrupt system that we are determined to dismantle. We will not stop until justice is served for every innocent person he has harmed." The room erupted in applause, but Emmanuel's mind was already on the battles ahead. The fight was far from over, but this time he was ready. The heavy doors of the presidential office swung open before anyone could announce Emmanuel's arrival. His footsteps echoed sharply across the marble floor, each one fueled by a mixture of anger and urgency that filled the grand room. President Ibrahim Traore looked up from his desk, surprise flashing across his face, before it was replaced by a calm, steady gaze. Emmanuel didn't wait for an invitation. His voice was low but firm, cutting through the silence. "Mr. President, I'm sorry for barging in like this, but this can't wait." Traore nodded, motioning for him to continue. "Laurent Gira is still poisoning lives. I have the evidence, the files, the testimonies. He's bribing officials, threatening workers, and framing innocent people like he did to me. This isn't just one man's wrongdoing. It's a network of corruption." The president's eyes narrowed. He leaned back, steepling his fingers as he listened intently. "This man destroyed my life," Emmanuel said, voice thick with emotion. "And now he's doing it again. To others who don't have the voice I'm finally finding." Traore's face hardened. For a moment, the weight of the nation's broken justice system pressed between them. "We stop him, this time for good," the president said with quiet conviction. Emmanuel took a deep breath, the anger slowly channeling into resolve. "What's the plan?" "We form a special commission," Traore replied, "a team of independent lawyers, investigators, and journalists. No political interference, no shortcuts. Complete transparency. They will dig into every corner of Gira's empire. And if they resist, we will hold them accountable. No one is above the law. Not the powerful, not the wealthy, not even the influential. This ends now." The room seemed to shrink under the weight of their shared determination. Emmanuel felt the full gravity of the moment. Years of pain and silence had led here, to this alliance, this promise. "I want to lead this effort," Emmanuel said firmly, "not just for myself, but for everyone who's been crushed by this broken system." Traore smiled faintly, respect shining through his tired eyes. "You've already led the way. Now we fight together." As the meeting ended, Emmanuel walked out with a renewed sense of purpose. The fight ahead would be difficult, the enemies powerful, the stakes high, but for the first time in years he was not alone. Together they would bring the truth into the light, and they would stop Laurent Gira, once and for all. The news spread like wildfire. Laurent Gira, the once untouchable tycoon, was under investigation. Charges were formally filed, and within days the nation watched in stunned silence as police officers arrived at his sprawling estate to arrest him. Handcuffed and led away, Gira's fall from grace was as dramatic as the empire he had built on the backs of the innocent. Inside the packed courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Journalists, citizens, and officials filled every seat, eager to witness a trial that had become a symbol of hope for justice in a nation long plagued by corruption. Emmanuel sat in the front row, his heart pounding, but his face calm. Beside him, President Ibrahim Traore watched intently, the weight of the moment mirrored in his eyes. This was more than a trial, it was a reckoning. As the prosecution presented evidence, documents exposing falsified records, witness testimonies detailing coercion and bribery, the courtroom murmured in disbelief. The carefully constructed facade of Jira's empire was crumbling before their eyes. Then came the most shocking moment. The judge who had once sentenced Emmanuel without fair trial was called to the stand. The courtroom fell silent as the man, once revered and feared, faced the weight of his own actions. Under intense questioning and confronted with mounting evidence, the judge's composure cracked. With a heavy sigh, he confessed. "I accepted bribes," he admitted quietly. "I was promised promotions, favors. I failed the law. I failed the people I swore to serve." Gasps echoed through the room. Some faces showed shock, others relief. The truth was raw and undeniable. Emmanuel listened closely, feeling the years of injustice pour out in the judge's confession. But there was no joy in this moment, only a solemn recognition that the system had betrayed them all. When the judge stepped down, Emmanuel rose to speak. His voice was steady, filled with the weight of experience and a fierce hope for change. "You took 7 years from me," he said, eyes locking with the judge's. "But you taught me something more important. Justice must be protected, not by the powerful, but by the brave." The courtroom erupted in applause, a cathartic release for a nation starved of accountability. Days later, the verdict was delivered. Laurent Jira was sentenced to 18 years in prison. The corrupt judge was dismissed, stripped of his honors, and barred from the legal profession. Victims who had suffered were compensated, their stories finally acknowledged. As Emmanuel stood alongside President Traore outside the courthouse, reporters clamored for comments. The two men exchanged a glance, one filled with the knowledge of battles won and many still ahead. "This is a new dawn," Traore declared to the crowd. "Let the powerful know their titles will not shield them from justice. Let the poor know they are not invisible. We see you, we hear you, and we will fight for you." Across the country, people celebrated. For the first time in generations, justice was not just a word, it was action. Emmanuel's journey from prisoner to advocate inspired countless others to raise their voices. His story became a beacon, illuminating the path toward a fairer future. And though the road ahead remained long and uncertain, the nation had taken its first step toward healing. The air in Ouagadougou buzzed with a newfound energy as President Ibrahim Traore stood before a packed hall announcing the launch of Operation Justice Light, a bold national campaign aimed at overhauling the country's broken justice system. The words he spoke were clear and unwavering, signaling a decisive break from the past. "Our nation has long suffered under shadows of injustice," Traore declared. "Today we ignite a light that will reach every prison, every courtroom, and every home. No longer will the innocent suffer in silence. This operation is a promise that justice will no longer be a privilege, but a right for all." The initiative was ambitious, to conduct comprehensive reviews of cases involving long-term prisoners, especially those without proper legal representation, and to identify wrongful imprisonments throughout Burkina Faso. This was not merely symbolic, it was a call to action. Emmanuel, now appointed as the head of the Justice Review Task Force, took the helm of this operation with the quiet determination that had defined his journey. He understood the magnitude of the task ahead. The campaign would require traveling to the remotest provinces, confronting entrenched corruption, and restoring faith in a system that many had come to distrust. To manage the vast scope, the task force was divided into smaller teams, each assigned to specific regions. These teams included lawyers, human rights advocates, and trained volunteers, all committed to listening to the unheard and uncovering the truth behind closed doors. Emmanuel's team embarked on their first mission to a prison in a small town several hundred kilometers from the capital. The journey was long and arduous, winding dirt roads, blistering sun, and the weight of expectations riding heavily on every step. Upon arrival, they were met with suspicion. The prison staff, accustomed to secrecy and minimal oversight, hesitated to cooperate. Yet Emmanuel's presence and the backing of the president carried a quiet authority. He spoke not with threats but with respect and empathy, emphasizing that their mission was not to punish, but to understand and to heal. Inside the cramped and overcrowded facility, the team began reviewing cases. They interviewed prisoners, many of whom had never seen a judge in years, let alone a lawyer. They documented inconsistencies, missing files, and signs of neglect. Each story was a thread in a vast tapestry of forgotten lives. Some inmates had been held for crimes with no evidence. Others had completed sentences but remained locked away due to clerical errors. Many had families who believed them lost forever. Emmanuel listened closely, his heart heavy but hopeful. This was the real work, the faces behind the files, the voices behind the silence. The teams traveled tirelessly from province to province, from prison to prison. Letters kept pouring into the presidential office, guiding their next destinations and revealing new cases of injustice. Communities that had felt invisible began to see change on the horizon. News of Operation Justice Light spread quickly. Local media covered the team's visits, shining a spotlight on the dark corners of the justice system. Human rights organizations praised the transparency and boldness of the campaign, while government officials found themselves under increasing pressure to reform. Yet resistance remained. Some prison officials resisted scrutiny. Powerful figures whispered warnings behind closed doors. But Traore and Emmanuel pressed on, united in their vision. For Emmanuel, every case reviewed, every innocent person freed, was a victory. A step toward a justice system rebuilt on fairness and compassion. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Emmanuel stood outside a small prison, watching the last rays of light touch the dusty earth. Around him, the voices of prisoners and families echoed softly, voices that would no longer be ignored. Operation Justice Light was more than a campaign. It was a movement, a beacon guiding Burkina Faso toward a brighter, more just future. The teams working under Operation Justice Light traveled far and wide, stepping into prisons where the walls whispered secrets no one dared to hear. With each visit, Emmanuel and his colleagues uncovered heartbreaking stories. Lives shattered by injustice, forgotten by society, and silenced behind bars. In one small town, they met a man imprisoned for speaking out against local corruption. His crime was simply raising his voice, demanding fair treatment for his community. For years, he had sat in a cell, punished not for breaking laws, but for challenging those in power. Nearby, a mother told a different tale of her son locked away for stealing a loaf of bread during a famine. The boy had no legal counsel, no chance to explain his desperate act. His sentence was harsh, his fate sealed by hunger and poverty rather than guilt. Emmanuel listened to these stories, each one a heavy stone in his heart. They were echoes of his own past, reminders that the fight for justice was far from over. But amidst the sorrow, there were moments of hope. During a visit to a small, dilapidated prison in a remote province, Emmanuel's team found a young boy named Thomas. Barely 17 when arrested during a protest, Thomas had spent 10 years behind bars. There was no trial record, no lawyer, no official documentation, only a faded entry in an old logbook. Thomas had been forgotten. His parents had died while he was locked away. His childhood vanished, his future stolen. Emmanuel knelt beside him, his voice soft but firm. "We're here now, Thomas. We hear you. We will fight for you." The boy's eyes, once dull with resignation, flickered with a fragile light, the first glimmer of hope in a decade. Within 48 hours, thanks to the intervention of the task force and President Traore's direct orders, Thomas was freed. The prison warden was suspended for negligence, and new protocols were established to prevent such disappearances. This rescue was just one of many small victories in a campaign that was transforming the nation's conscience. Stories like Thomas's spread quickly, inspiring others to come forward. Letters poured in from families, prisoners, and advocates, each one a cry for justice and a call to action. Emmanuel and his teams pressed on, their mission clear but challenging. The path was fraught with resistance, red tape, and the weight of centuries-old systems built to maintain silence and control. Yet with every innocent life reclaimed, the movement gained strength. One afternoon, as Emmanuel walked through the courtyard of another prison, a former inmate approached him quietly. "Thank you," the man said, tears in his eyes. "You gave me my life back." Those words fueled Emmanuel's resolve, reminding him that justice was more than laws and courts. It was about restoring humanity. As the sun set on another day of Operation Justice Light, Emmanuel stood looking at the horizon. The shadows of the past still lingered, but the dawn was breaking. The stories from the shadows would no longer be buried. They would be heard. They would be the foundation for a new era of justice in Burkina Faso. As Operation Justice Light unfolded across Burkina Faso, it became clear that freeing the wrongly imprisoned was only the first step. Emmanuel and President Traore knew that true justice required more than release. It required restoration. To address the needs of those who had suffered unjustly, the government launched the Freedom Restoration Fund, a comprehensive program designed to provide financial support, education, and housing for former prisoners. Many had lost everything: their homes, their families, and their livelihoods. The fund aimed to rebuild lives, not just unlock prison doors. Emmanuel played a pivotal role in shaping the program. Drawing from his own experience, he understood that justice without support was incomplete. The fund offered scholarships for education and vocational training, grants to start small businesses, and safe housing for those without a place to return. At the same time, the campaign tackled corruption head-on. Judges, police officers, and officials found complicit in wrongful convictions faced investigations and consequences. The message was clear: no one was above the law. One high-profile case involved a judge who had been dismissed and stripped of his honors after evidence revealed his acceptance of bribes. Police officers who had coerced confessions or ignored legal procedures were suspended or prosecuted. These actions sent ripples through the justice system, signaling a new era of accountability. The public response was powerful. Communities once skeptical of the legal system began to see tangible change. Stories of wrongful imprisonment turned to stories of freedom and rebuilding. Trust slowly returned. In villages and cities alike, people started to believe again that the law could protect them, that justice could be fair, and that their voices mattered. Emmanuel often traveled to meet with families affected by the reforms. He listened to their hopes and fears, sharing stories of progress and promising continued efforts. One mother, who had lost her son to years of wrongful imprisonment, embraced Emmanuel tearfully during a visit to her village. "Thank you," she whispered. "You gave us hope when we had none." These moments fueled Emmanuel's resolve, reminding him that justice was not an abstract concept, but a living, breathing reality that touched every life. The reforms also inspired other African nations, with leaders visiting Burkina Faso to learn from its bold approach. Human rights organizations praised the courage and transparency that had brought systemic change. Yet Emmanuel and Traore knew the work was ongoing. They emphasized that vigilance was necessary to prevent old patterns from returning. The Freedom Restoration Fund and the crackdown on corruption were pillars of a new justice system, one built on fairness, transparency, and humanity. As Emmanuel stood alongside President Traore during a national broadcast, the president addressed the nation with a message that resonated deeply. "We have begun to heal the wounds of the past. Let this be a promise. No more silence, no more shadows. Justice belongs to all of us, and together we will protect it." Across Burkina Faso, a new chapter was unfolding. The chains of injustice were breaking, replaced by the bonds of hope and trust. The journey was far from over, but the nation had taken a decisive step toward a brighter future. The heavy metal door creaked open, the familiar scent of dust and stone filling Emmanuel's lungs as he stepped back into the small cell that had once confined him. The narrow room was unchanged, its cold gray walls still bearing the faint marks of forgotten years. But today it was different. A small bronze plaque hung on the wall, catching the dim light. Etched into it were the simple words, "From this cell, justice was born." Emmanuel's fingers brushed over the metal, tracing each letter with reverence. The words held a weight far greater than the cold steel around him. They told a story of pain transformed into hope, silence broken by truth. As he stood in the place where he had once been invisible, Emmanuel felt a surge of emotion. This tiny cell had held not only his body, but also the spark that ignited a nation's fight for justice. The same walls that had witnessed despair now bore witness to resilience. Behind him, footsteps echoed softly. President Ibrahim Traore entered, standing beside Emmanuel, their eyes meeting with a shared understanding. No words were needed. Together they looked out through the barred window, toward the light that had once seemed unreachable. This was not an end, but a beginning, a testament that even in the darkest places, the seeds of change could take root and grow. Not long after that visit, President Traore summoned Emmanuel to the presidential palace with a proposal that would change his life forever. "I want you to be my senior advisor on human rights and justice," Traore said, his tone both earnest and commanding. "You will work alongside me, not just for prisoners, but for every voiceless citizen in our country." Emmanuel felt the enormity of the role settle over him. He was no longer a victim or a symbol. He was a leader tasked with shaping a fairer future. With this new responsibility, Emmanuel began crafting policies aimed at strengthening the justice system, ensuring legal aid for the poor, and training law enforcement in human rights. But his work extended far beyond the palace walls. He traveled extensively, visiting remote villages and towns, often by foot or motorcycle. Under mango trees and in humble classrooms, Emmanuel taught people about their legal rights and the power they held as citizens. He listened to stories of suffering and resilience, empowering communities to stand up against injustice. His presence brought hope to those who had long been ignored, showing them that justice was not a distant ideal, but a living reality within reach. Emmanuel's voice, once silenced, now echoed across the nation, a beacon of courage and change. 1 year after the launch of Operation Justice Light, the capital city was alive with celebration. Thousands gathered in the main stadium, each wearing a white sash emblazoned with the words "Justice Restored." The crowd's energy was electric, a mixture of joy, relief, and determination. Emmanuel stood before them, the microphone steady in his hands. The faces before him were those of former prisoners, families reunited, and citizens who had witnessed a nation reclaim its dignity. He spoke softly at first, then with growing strength. "I once thought my life was over," he said, his voice carrying through the stadium. "I once thought silence was my only companion. But today I stand before you not as a victim, but as a partner in rebuilding justice." He looked out over the crowd, eyes shining with tears. "I forgive those who hurt me. I thank those who listened. And I challenge each of you. Listen to the unheard. Stand for the unseen. Speak for the voiceless. Let your freedom be louder than your silence." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. As twilight descended, thousands of candles were lit across the stadium and throughout the city, a sea of flickering lights symbolizing the nation's collective hope and commitment. That night, the candlelight of justice shone brighter than ever, illuminating not just the faces of those present, but the heart of a country transformed. This story teaches us the power of courage, compassion, and perseverance in the face of injustice. It reminds us that one person's voice can spark a movement that transforms not only individual lives, but an entire system. Justice is not merely a concept. It requires action, accountability, and unwavering commitment to truth. In our own lives, we can stand up for those who are unheard, challenge unfairness, and foster empathy. Change begins when we listen deeply and act boldly, even when the odds seem overwhelming. Action. Question: how can you use your voice today to stand for justice or support someone who feels invisible? If this story touched you, don't let it stop here. Like, share, and subscribe to Captain of Truth, where every voice matters and every story echoes far beyond the screen. This story is a fictionalized and dramatized narrative created for educational, inspirational, and storytelling purposes. While it may be inspired by real public events, people, or societal issues, it includes imagined dialogue, reconstructed scenes, and character interpretations meant to highlight broader themes of justice, dignity, and resilience. Any resemblance to actual events or individuals beyond public knowledge is purely coincidental. We do not intend to defame, mislead, or harm, but to invite reflection and meaningful conversation. Thank you for watching Captain of Truth.